Thank you. I am delighted to introduce Professor Stephen Fiore as our opening keynote speaker for CSCL 2019. I have known Steve since he was a graduate student at the University of Pittsburgh at the Learning Research and Development Center, where he received his PhD in cognitive science. After losing touch for quite a while, maybe decades, but it can't be that long because we're not old enough, I've been delighted to find connections with his work on the science of team science, team cognition, and collaborative problem solving. These are issues that are near and dear to the CSCL community, and I was really thrilled when I heard that Steve would be delivering our opening keynote. He is a professor at the University of Central Florida in both the Cognitive Science Program and the Department of Philosophy. He is director of the Cognitive Sciences Laboratory there. His primary area of research is the study of complex collaborative cognition and the understanding of how humans interact socially and with technology. Again, just a perfect fit for this conference. Dr. Fiore was a member of the expert panel for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's 2015 PISA assessment, which focused on collaborative problem solving. He's also contributed to working groups for the National Academy of Sciences in understanding and measuring 21st century skills, and was a member of their Science of Team Science consensus study. I am just delighted to welcome Steve Fiore to give our opening keynote at CSCL 2019 on integrating theorizing on embodied, inactive, extended, embedded cognition to augment CSCL research. So Steve, come on up.
So it's really an honor to be here and talk to this community because, as Cindy said, there's been a lot of overlap, and we've talked for years about getting together and bringing communities together. And this idea of interdisciplinary research and connecting communities is something that's been really near and dear to my heart. And there's a natural overlap between what this organization pursues as well as what my colleagues in the organizational sciences pursue when it comes to teamwork. But as usual, I tend to improv when I come up and speak, and since she brought up the Learning Research and Development Center, I thought I should give some background as to why I started studying collaboration, because at LRDC, it was an interdisciplinary institute, and there were a handful of people who really didn't study learning per se, and I happened to work for an advisor who wasn't a learning researcher. This was Dr. Jonathan Schooler, mainstream cognitive psychologist, and he was studying memory and problem solving. But his primary area of work was in what was called verbal overshadowing. And the verbal overshadowing paradigm is what happens when you put various parts of cognition into words. And his line of research showed that for certain facets of cognition that there is an overshadowing effect, meaning it's going to interfere with the kind of cognition that someone had just memorized or the kind of cognition in which they were engaged. And I had taken a class on problem solving with Dr. Jim Voss at LRDC, and one of the topics was group problem solving. So I thought that was interesting, and I decided to write a paper on that, and I was thinking, well, groups, what do they do when they solve problems? They talk. All of our research is how talking interferes with cognition. Might it be that talking in a group hinders collaboration, hinders cognition? And indeed, for a lot of that research I did back then, it was showing the negative effects of collaboration on cognition. And the reality is, depending upon the kind of analysis you do, collaboration tends to interfere with cognition, and depending upon the task, you may be very well better served by having individuals work on that task. So because groups and teams are problematic when it comes to cognition, but we need groups and teams to improve our world's problems and address our world's problems, I spent the remainder of my career trying to improve team cognition, trying to improve team coordination, but it all started at the Learning Research and Development Center, where people were looking at collaboration and cognition in a particular facet. So I know it's a long preamble, but I just wanted to preface that because I'm not truly a learning scientist like you all are, so that's a long way to hedge my area of expertise. So with that said, given the conference theme, I wanted to talk about 4E cognition and kind of set the stage for this, because in discussing this with a few members of this community, I learned that this is a topic that's not necessarily familiar with everybody, but some of you are already aware about these developments in cognitive science. So these first couple of parts of my talk are likely to be redundant for some, and hopefully it's going to be new for others. But I really want to contextualize what's been happening in the development in cognitive sciences when it comes to 4E cognition, that is embodied and active, extended and embedded cognition. The second part of my talk, though, is where I bring in team research and ideas that have been developing and percolating in team research, and how I've been observing how that field has been growing in unique ways, and how that field itself can also be seen through this lens of 4E cognition, what Chris has been referring to as this wide lens of cognition. And when I was asked to give this talk, I used this as an excuse to think about the paper that I've been meaning to write, that is teams as 4E cognition, that is teams as embedded and active extended cognition itself. So we think about team theory in a number of different dimensions, but I've seen bits and pieces of 4E cognition emerging in the literature, and this talk gave me an opportunity to reify some of these ideas. So I thought I'd give you some background. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with this book, but if you look at the beginning of a particular field or a particular area of inquiry, you can trace back this movement in cognitive science to the book by Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Eleanor Roche. So you can say a philosopher, a biologist, and a cognitive psychologist walk into a bar, and they ended up writing this book. But no, it was an interesting kind of collection of people, because Francisco Varela is a biologist, Evan Thompson is a philosopher, and Eleanor Roche is a cognitive psychologist. And they were essentially not very happy with what they were seeing going on in the study of cognition, and they thought that there should be more attention paid to the body's role in cognition, that is, seriously consider what role the body plays in cognition. So they laid out this book, and they were thinking about from their different perspectives, because Francisco Varela, as a biologist, was studying cells and the relationship of their cellular activity and cellular processes within particular environments, and how there is this reciprocal relationship between cells and the environment with which they evolve. Evan Thompson was a philosopher looking at Eastern philosophy and mindfulness and Buddhism, and the important point there is Buddhist philosophy never separated the body and the mind. So he knew with Western thought, where we talk about dualism and the separation of body and mind, Evan Thompson wasn't very appreciative of that perspective and wanted to incorporate these more Eastern influences in the study of cognition. And Eleanor Roche, as a cognitive psychologist, had been studying categories and concepts, looking at natural kinds and natural categories, but she was intrigued by what she was seeing, because when she was studying what she called basic level or prototype categories, what she realized that across a number of different areas of categorization, the basic level happened to be the one with which you could most easily interact at the bodily level. So she was thinking about this from the standpoint of cognitive psychology and the relationship between the body and mind, and that kind of was the precursor for them coming together. But like all ideas in science, it was a beginning, a kind of a nascent development, and people started to ask more questions. They were intrigued by this, and they said, well, is it more than just being a body? What about that body interacting in a world? What about the bodies using that world? And what about the situated nature of that body within a world? And all of those ideas and those lines of questioning have now become what we now we consider 4E cognition, that is this wider lens of cognition. But it started with this idea of embodiment, but like all fields within science, these ideas themselves are evolving. So to understand why this matters, I need to back up a little bit and get back to the origins of the study of cognition and cognitive psychology. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but cognitive psychology really grew up with this kind of information processing view of cognition. That is, you think about input and you think about output. So it grew up specifically because they were using the computer metaphor of mind. It grew up adjacent to computer science and the development of artificial intelligence. And there was a lot of influence in the way thinking about thinking and the way thinking about computers could think. And this is why this had such a tremendous sway on the way cognition was viewed. So thinking was simply in terms of inputs and outputs. It had to do with manipulations and acting on amodal symbol systems. And solutions were devised by this kind of symbolic reasoning, and representations were manipulated via computation. And the argument was that you can think about cognition, you can understand cognition entirely by internal processes. So this is problematic when you step back and think about the theoretical implications for information processing and how you approach cognition. And this relationship between the mind and world as being separate is somewhat problematic because it drives the belief for internal representations. That is, that we believe the mind needs to represent the world to act on that world. And the body is simply an input and output device. The environment is only a place for cognition. So this kind of isolationist assumption is problematic because it underplays the role of the body in cognition, and it completely ignores the environment in cognition. And from this, it decreases your explanatory power. That is, you really can't come to a full understanding of the richness of cognition through this kind of isolationist assumption. And again, getting back to graduate school, in the 90s, I was still very much an information processing thinker when it came to cognition. I was trained fully and entirely in what we call the cognitivist view of cognition. And this started to percolate around that time, and it wasn't until I got my job at UCF and started interacting with philosophers that they introduced me to, well, you know, there's different ways of thinking about cognition, and those philosophers themselves have been influenced by early 20th century thinkers like Merleau-Ponty, who never really ignored the role of body in cognition and the body in perception. So some interesting developments over the years that we're trying to take on this mainstream effect or perspective on cognition. So that's kind of setting the stage and where we are and how the field has been adapting. And I'll note that this view of embodied cognition and Fourier cognition has not fully taken hold. That is, within cognitive psychology, there are still lots of arguments going on, which are a good thing. And within cognitive science, there's still many people who believe in representations and representational systems and symbolic reasoning. So the field itself is still evolving, and it's exciting to see CSCL involved now because I think it's going to help us from a theoretical standpoint. Now, though, I want to get into some definitions and examples of what we mean by embodied and active, extended, and embedded cognition. And I'll preface that with saying, you really knew this all along. That is, when we look at the learning sciences and we look at the kind of research that has been done, a number of people have been doing 4E cognition. They're just not necessarily using the terminology that has been evolving within this specific perspective. So some of this will be familiar to you, and I've tried to choose some idiosyncratic examples to illuminate how these different perspectives on cognition might be informative. So first, when it comes to embodied cognition, what they really try to pay attention to are the physical properties of the body and how it plays a role in cognition. And the attention here is on the sensory and motor system. That is, the particular way a body is endowed determines and constitutes cognitive processes. So the sensory motor system of an organism is what determines cognition. So the body's role in all facets of cognition are what they're paying attention to. And this is a really subtly important point because when you think about the sensory motor system with which an organism is endowed and you see that role in cognition, it really gives you pause for thought in how we understand our world. And as a simple example, think about our visual system. So if you think about the electromagnetic spectrum and you look at the range of energy, the ambient energy out there, for only the last century or so did we really come to understand the different forms of energy. Everything prior to that was essentially the little sliver of visible light. Our perceptual system only allowed us to see a small amount of ambient energy in the environment, that is visual light, and through that we came to categorize, we came to understand our entire world. That was the reality we understood. But now, thanks to the introductions of technologies, it allows us to see short wavelengths, long wavelengths. We get to understand the full range of the electromagnetic spectrum, and that's simply an illustration to show you the limitations of our sensory and motor system and how it influences our cognitive processes. So I brought up that example because when going through Mike Eisenberg's memorial, I was intrigued to see that he had a makerspace on what we call biohacking. And biohacking is a new development that's kind of engineering, it's kind of neuroscience, it's kind of biology, and this is where people are altering their bodies and altering their body's sensory system. And I find this fascinating for a number of reasons, mostly because they're altering their sensory motor system in ways that I think are going to be altering cognition. And I'd like to be provocative and think about this as the next evolution of humanity. Right now we talk about how we're wedded with our machines, but biohackers are actually literally integrating their bodies with machines and therefore influencing their sensory system, therefore changing their cognitive processes. So an example of embodied cognition in the learning sciences. There were lots of examples I could think of, but I pulled this one out because I thought it was a really elegant study, but also I think it illustrated a particular facet of embodied cognition. And the idea here is that when you interact with particular forms of learning content, in this case physical forces, it's going to help you improve your understanding of those concepts. So Contra and colleagues wanted to study kinetic energy and angular momentum and how students come to understand these complex concepts. So this is a traditional form of STEM education research, but they looked at it in new ways. They wanted to use embodied cognition as a way to illuminate what this concept meant. So you see in the upper right-hand corner that they actually interacted with this device, with this wheel, where the wheels could move at different speeds, and they could rotate that wheel so they could feel, that is, embody angular momentum. And that's juxtaposed with the traditional way of understanding these concepts through things like diagrams or animations. The fundamental difference is, does your sensory motor system actually engage with the force itself? And indeed, they found that those students who were interacting with the wheel, that is, that are executing these actions themselves, having to do with the physical experience of angular momentum, improve their understanding of these compared to those in the observation group. And this was an intriguing study, I think, because they wanted to influence the cognitivists, that is, the information processing people. They actually, like most cognitive psychology research, threw them in a scanner as well and did an fMRI study. And they actually showed that the sensory motor system of the people who used the wheel was activated when they thought about angular momentum, as opposed to the people who only looked at the diagram. Therefore, directly linking the particular parts of the brain associated with motor activity and the sensation of that motor activity to understand angular momentum was changing the way they viewed that concept. So again, a nice, elegant study where we think about embodiment and the physical embodiment of these complex concepts. Next is this idea of enactive cognition. And I admit the differences between embodied and enactive cognitions are slippery, and this really has to do with the unfolding and the evolution of these ideas. So the simplest way to think about it is embodied cognition has to do with the action-oriented version of embodied cognition. That is, in activism, you think about the movement of a body through space. So I use that example of embodied cognition with the wheel because that was a body standing still and simply experiencing, their sensory motor system experiencing the movement, that is the energy of that system. When we talk about enactivism, though, we're talking about a body moving through space. So the organism is said to make sense of its world through interaction. And this goes back to old school ecological psychology and perception action theories. So this, too, has an idea that originates in the early 20th century, but was largely ignored by many in cognitive psychology and visual perception research. The only person who never ignored this was Gibson. And if you're familiar with your cognitive psychology history, he was kind of himself ignored by cognitive psychology. He had to invent an entire field called ecological psychology because he didn't buy into the cognitivist view. He did not buy into the information processing views of perception, and he thought something else was going on there. So this idea of action-oriented cognition and this movement, this perceptual motor actions, is an important component of enactivism because they talk about this adaptive coupling as a body interacts with the environment. So they think about it as a process of sense-making. And what they say is that the environment itself is a place for action possibilities. That is, the way the organism is endowed, it sees that environment and it knows how to interact with that environment, and it makes sense of that environment through this interaction. And you have in the picture there, the bottom right-hand corner, an outfielder, because the outfielder is used as an example to explain and juxtapose enactive and embodied cognition perspectives with traditional information processing views of cognition. So I'll give you what the outfielder problem illustrates in this short vignette. So if you're not familiar with American baseball, what the outfielder does is they're way out there, that is, out in the field, and they have to catch the fly balls. And it is not necessarily a simple task. So the fly ball is when the batter hits the ball, it gets way out there. And what the outfielder needs to do is coordinate his or her body movements with the velocity of that ball, with the angle of that ball, such that it reaches the ball at the right time, at the right height of that catcher's body. And if you're in computer science and robotics and you think about how the hell to program a robot to do something like that, you know it is an incredibly complex endeavor. If you're in information processing viewer of cognition, you would think about, okay, what are the kinds of algorithms that need to be developed? You have to take into account geometry, you have to take into account velocity, you have to take into account momentum, and the belief was that the outfielder was doing all of that kind of symbolic reasoning as the outfielder was trying to catch that ball. But the inactivists and the embodied researchers said, you know, I think there's a simpler way to think about this. You don't need all of that computation. All you really need to do is for the outfielder to maintain size constancy of the ball in space. And what that means is the outfielder only needs to look at that ball to regulate the speed to which that outfielder runs towards the ball and ensure it stays the same size so that he will meet that ball at the right place and the right time in order to catch that ball. So it was purely perception and action without any need for computation that allows the outfielder to catch that ball. So this was the initial argument to show how you could engage in these kinds of complex cognitive processes in the absence of any kind of computation, and this has since been validated in laboratory studies using virtual reality. But when it comes to learning sciences and active cognition, there's a lot of interesting work out there now, how the body is used to interact with to-be-learned material in order to improve understanding. So I just pulled a representative example. Rob Lindgren and colleagues, they actually developed a mixed reality simulation to help students move through a particular space. And this was another one of these STEM education grants funded by the National Science Foundation, with the idea being, can we use this theoretical lens of embodied and active cognition to help students experience concepts in new ways? So this was all about astronomy and helping students understand planetary movement and gravitational influences on planets. So the students essentially embodied an asteroid, and their movement in this mixed reality space was meant to mimic a spring in that space, launching an asteroid past planets. And depending upon the velocity of the spring that they loaded, they may or may not pass by a planet, because if it passed by a planet going too slowly, it would get caught in that planet's gravity, but if it was going fast enough, it would pass by that planet. So the idea was to help students understand this notion of planetary astronomy and learning about gravitational acceleration by embodying and enacting gravitational forces. So they did your traditional learning sciences research, and they were able to show differences in learning dependent upon whether they used a simple simulation, what we call a butts and seats kind of simulation where they're playing with a computer, versus actually embodied and enacting this kind of movement in space. So a nice illustration of this, and this is really an emerging and interesting area of research. Mina Johnson-Glenberg has been doing a nice job not only empirically, but unpacking the different forms of enaction. So I really recommend you look at these papers to get a better understanding of how people have been thinking more deeply about these concepts. And then we move to extended cognition. So we're going now from the body's movement in space, to the environment and the body's use of the environment for particular forms of cognition. So the idea here is that the brain is inextricably coupled with the external environment. And through the extended or externalized cognition perspective, we argue that what is normally construed as cognition within the head can occur outside the head as well. So the simple example you'll often see in these writings, people will talk about taking notes or working out a problem on paper. And from the extended cognition perspective, we'll say, well, taking notes is really a form of memory. Working out a problem on paper is actually an act of cognition. And there's been a lot of work in this, and it comes under different labels. In the learning sciences, you hear about external representations and the manipulations of external representations. And what I mean by this is you're familiar with this concept, even if you're not necessarily using the lingo of 4E cognition. And these externalizations are said to help us think about more complex kinds of data and information. So it saves on internal memory, and I'll get more into that later, but it helps create these kinds of persistent reference that are manipulated that help coordinate thought. So these artifacts and these representations of cognition not simply aid cognition, but actually constitute cognition. And that, again, is another one of these subtle but very important theoretical differences. From extended cognition theory, the argument is this is cognition. The externalization, the representation, is cognition. So you may be asking, why do I have a stamp of Richard Feynman? on this slide? Well, I have a stamp of Richard Feynman because he's used as kind of an example or an exemplar of this idea of extended cognition. And on this stamp, they commemorated the Nobel Prize winner and his development of Feynman diagrams. So the Feynman diagrams were a particular language he invented, a symbolic language he invented to help understand quantum physics. And the anecdote goes that the historian Howard Weiner came across Feynman's notes and was very excited to find his notes, his papers throughout his career. And he called Feynman and he said, "Hey, I have a record of your work. Isn't this great? You know, all the great work you did way back then, I have a record." And Feynman says, "Well, it's actually my work. It's not a record of my work." And Weiner was kind of taken aback because Feynman is, if you don't know, kind of someone who's abrupt and very short with people. And he was basically saying, "No, that's not a record, that is the work. And I did the work on paper." And essentially from an extended cognition perspective, he was saying the cognition in quantum mechanics did not happen in his head. The cognition happened on the paper. So this was this coupled system of Feynman pen on paper, Feynman working through the development of these concepts with paper. So the cognition was this kind of reciprocal loop of brain, body, and environment. And this is a very important distinction because it allows you to think more broadly of what do we mean by cognition. Cognition is not simply something occurring in the head. So as an example in the learning sciences, as I said, there's a number from which I could pull, but this is a brand new one that was particularly intriguing. It's not really learning sciences, but it's related to an area of inquiry associated with the learning sciences, and that's intelligence testing. So this is one that's hot off the press. It just came out in Nature Human Behavior, and I was really excited to see this because one of the co-authors was Andy Clark, the philosopher Andy Clark, who has been a prominent thinker in this area of extended cognition. So he decided to put his money where his mouth is and do some research, do some empirical research. So what they did is they took a traditional intelligence test and they said, okay, if we believe this idea of extended cognition, can we take the to-be-learned material, can we distribute it across an individual in their environment and create this cognitive system? And by doing so, how does that influence learning and cognition? So these representations, remember, these are knowledge structures in the environment. These are kind of physical configurations of rules, the constraints in which you engage when you're working in particular problems. So Bocanegra et al., what they did is they used a modified version of Raven's progressive matrices. So if you're not familiar with psychometrics, this is the quintessential measure of G. This is supposed to be the measure of pure intelligence, the ability to solve Raven's progressive matrices. What they did is they modified that so that you had a computerized version of it where you can dynamically manipulate and reconfigure the symbols such that it allowed you to solve the problems by generating solutions, manipulating those solutions, seeing what was correct. So the distinction here is normally when you do this task, it all has to be inside the head. It essentially is a very intensive use of working memory to solve this problem because you're looking at these symbols and you have to come up with the logical patterns of these symbols to figure out what would be the next pattern to solve this problem. But they said, okay, if we believe in extended cognition, let's create an externalization of these visual spatial manipulations and then see how that predicts, this is the important point, how that predicts other forms of academic performance. Because most people would say, well, you do well on Raven's progressive matrices, you're a smart person, you should do well academically. And I think the hardcore information processing people would say the people who did well on the purely internal method of this would do better in school. But indeed, what this study showed is that the people who externalized their cognition and did better with the externalizations were doing better academically as well. So they related real-world academics with this very abstract form of cognitive processing. We're able to show that the use of external representations, their ability to use these to manipulate symbols, actually helped produce an understanding of these problems that was more predictive of academic success. So as I said, this is brand new, it's hot off the press, so I'm really intrigued to see what this does to the field and how people start arguing about this finding, because I think it's an important one with regard to juxtaposing cognitivism, that is information processing, with this more extended view of cognition. And then last but not least is this idea of embedded cognition. So this is this view, this broader view of not simply a body interacting with the world or with technology, but now a body interacting in a world, but in situ. That is, this body is in place. So it pays attention to not only to the context, but the social and cultural aspects of the environment. So those of you in the learning sciences, you're very familiar with situated learning and situated cognition. So this is essentially a new way of thinking about that in a slightly different way, but you'll see there's a lot of overlap with that. But the idea here in active and embedded cognition is that the user of particular technologies not only extends cognition through this technology, but also makes use of the environment with which that technology is embedded to solve very complex problems. So this is a photograph of a very complex socio-technical system, an engineering plant, and I think this is a recycling plant. So this is a very challenging task, so a lot of technology is needed to monitor that plant. So the idea here would be not only is the extended cognition, the brain, the body, and the technology, but the environment with which these people are interacting, that's helping them work through these very complex forms of cognition to solve their problems, to make decisions in this kind of environment. So as an example of this in the learning sciences, again, your literature is replete with these. I chose one that I found kind of intriguing because it was a nice study of looking at a theory of action, that is situated action, situated learning, in what's called the Digital Youth Network. And this is an after-school program up in Chicago. And what they were doing there, this is a study by Gomez and Lee that came out a few years ago, and they were looking at what they called these learning pods, which are a form of socially situated cognition, and student and mentor relationships, and they're able to show that students bring their own kind of expertise to bear in this, but the space that's created, this place for this situated cognition, is one where their creative processes are made public. So in this space, they learn how to create, they learn how to critique, they learn how to negotiate in this relationship, not only with the artifacts that they're using, in this case they're developing technologies, but also with the people with whom they're interacting, that is the mentors, and with each other. So it's a nice demonstration of situated cognition and cognition in practice to illustrate these nuances about cognition in an embedded sense. So now to wrap this up, I want to compare and contrast and juxtapose this information processing view of cognition on the left with the 4E view of cognition. So information processing, in these debates, it's referred to as cognitivist or cognitivism. So first, again, it's the idea of the computer metaphor of mind. So information processing, the metaphor of mind, there's algorithms, it's logic-driven. You can contrast that with the 4E view that says, no, we talk about a coupling metaphor of mind. We talk about the form of embodiment. We talk about action of that body in a particular environment, and that's what determines cognition. The next one, though, is this idea of isolationism. So the isolationist analysis is the sense that you can understand cognition simply by looking at this disembodied brain. So the brain in a vat, so to speak, and the 4E view of cognition is in complete contrast to that and says you need to look at a relational analysis. So it's not simply a brain in a vat, it's an interplay of a brain, body, and environment that determines cognition, that determines the actions that afford particular forms of cognition, which relates directly to item 3. Again, the cognitivist view, this information processing view, is all about computation. In the 4E view of cognition, it's about goal-directed action. And I refer back to the outfielder problem, where you can compare and contrast how the outfielder could catch a ball without computation whatsoever. And then I mentioned also this notion of inputs and outputs. So cognition is a form of input and retrieval of stored representations from the cognitivist view. You can compare, you can juxtapose that with this idea of cognition as a kind of active construction. And it's, again, based upon how that organism is endowed. The organism's embodiment itself determines the goal-directed actions that determine the form of cognition. And finally, to juxtapose this symbolic and coded representations from the information processing view, you compare that to the sensorimotor or motor representations in the 4E view, and also you can take into account the external representations using things like artifacts as part of cognition. So this is really a simplistic notion, but the take-home point I want you to realize is that the 4E view of cognition is itself evolving. So it started with embodied cognition, and as a nice illustration of how it was evolving, there was an important paper written by Margaret Wilson in Psychonomic Bulletin and Review back in 2002 called 6 Views of Embodied Cognition. And she was a mainstream cognitive psychologist, and she had been paying attention to these arguments about embodiment. And what she did is she kind of fractionalized and categorized these different perspectives. And if you go back and read that paper, what she was initially doing was recognizing these subtle distinctions between embodiment, a pure embodied view, between enaction and an enactive view of cognition, between embedded cognition and between extended cognition. And again, the point I'm trying to make is we're not settled on what these ideas mean. Like any new idea in science, this is one that's evolving, and this is why it's very important that this new community really pays attention to these developments, because I think you can make contributions from a theoretical standpoint to help us flesh out what we mean. So again, that's a whirlwind tour, so to speak, of 4E cognition. Now I want to translate into something that I hope will be new, and this is the perspective of a team researcher, that is someone who studies teams interaction, team coordination, and the kind of exciting new kinds of research in the field of team cognition, in the field of team science, that I think can be directly connected with 4E cognition. So I mentioned earlier I was excited about this talk because it would force me to put pen to paper, so to speak, because this is something that I think needs to be laid out more specifically and more directly, how teams themselves can be viewed through this lens of 4E cognition. So I'm going to walk through these examples, but I wanted to preface this with introducing this meta-scientific issue associated with this kind of research. So team researchers are usually just social psychologists and organizational psychologists. But what we've seen over the years are now computer scientists are becoming involved in this research, and more importantly, forming teams with these other kinds of researchers. And these computer scientists are bringing a new perspective and new technologies to help us better understand team interaction. We're also seeing more ethnomethodological approaches in the study of teams, so we see anthropologists involved. So you're familiar with some of this kind of interdisciplinary research already in CSCL, but my point here is it's also having an impact on the study of teams more generally. And what this does is create interdisciplinary research teams, and the creation of interdisciplinary research teams is essentially a double-edged sword. It's an exciting possibility of new perspectives that will inform the development of new theory and involve the creation of new technologies, new methods. But there's a problematic relationship because, as you've probably experienced yourself, when you bring different disciplines together, conflict will emerge. Because you have different worldviews, you have different ideas about what is knowledge, what counts as knowledge, you have different views about empiricism, that itself creates challenges when it comes to this kind of research. And I think that it's important to recognize that and not take it lightly, because this is what we're essentially this call to action. You want to invite this interdisciplinary research community to address this very complex problem of 4E cognition in CSCL, but also recognize the inherent challenges that will come with it from the standpoint of collaborating across disciplines. So again, with that as preface, now what I'm going to do is provide kind of an idiosyncratic view of team research that I think nicely aligns with this idea of 4E cognition. So this is really just representative examples that I pulled from the literature that in this first case has to do with embodied cognition. And I chose this one specifically because it was a particular form of embodied cognition. What they were doing was using physiological measurements. They were using galvanic skin response and studying bodily changes in galvanic skin response as teams interacted. And what they wanted to understand was what we call synchrony of teamwork. So synchronization of activity is something I'm sure is familiar to a number of you. What we're seeing now, though, is the development of biological, physiological synchronization, not only communicative synchronization, but physiological synchronization. So they were looking at this physiological synchronization in the context of a particular kind of teamwork requiring coordination. And they had these concepts associated with team literature having to do with drivers of the team and empaths in the team. So drivers were the ones that were pushing themselves on the team. Empaths on the team were the more followers, that is, the ones that were seeing what other people were doing and going along with what these other people were doing. The intriguing part of this research is you could see from the galvanic skin response who were the drivers. So actually the physiological changes of the drivers led to eventually a change in physiology of the empaths. And the empaths, their physiology was more likely to align with the people they were observing. So you see this interesting synchrony between drivers and empaths, this physiological synchrony as they went and worked through this coordinative problem solving. And they also did some traditional team measurement, and believe it or not, the empaths were viewed more positively than the drivers. So just think about it. The drivers are the ones that are pushing themselves literally, figuratively, and physiologically on the other members of the team and influencing those teams not only from a behavioral standpoint, but in this case from a physiological standpoint. And the attitudinal consequence of that is the empaths were viewed more favorably than the drivers. So again, just an interesting example of linking particular facets of the body and physiology of the body and now extending it onto a different level of analysis, that is, that body interacting in a group. Now, with regard to enactive cognition, I liked this study for a number of reasons. This was research that connected computer science and machine learning with traditional group studies, but in the area of design studies, an area that I find really fascinating and important, and I'm excited to see design studies having increasing influence across a number of different domains. So this group of researchers were studying design-team interaction, but they wanted to look at emotional states as they relate to bodily postures in a design team and see the degree to which they could automatically detect these bodily postures. So those of you who do traditional kinds of studies in this area, you know there's a lot of laborious hand coding of bodily postures and gestures. Well, they used machine learning and they looked at things like velocity and position of bodies, linked those those kinds of metrics to body language like nodding, and that's a kind of engagement, or leaning get back, and that's a kind of boredom. And they connected this data acquisition using non-contact sensors. That's an important point because the galvanic skin response study I just described, you had to put something on the participants. The exciting interdisciplinary research we're seeing now is in the area of non-contact sensors. You don't have to wire up the participants. New forms of visualization, new forms of cameras are being developed where you can monitor and track and automatically encode these interactions. And this was a nice study because they used these non-contact sensors to study body language, and their machine learning algorithms were actually able to accurately identify these poses, relate those to emotional stances, and relate that to design processes. So machine learning could accurately diagnose posture and poses in such a way that it was related to emotion and related to behavioral and cognitive outcomes. So a nice perspective, taking enactive cognition, but again, looking at teamwork. So moving up a level to extended cognition, and now not simply bodies interacting, but bodies interacting with technology. This is a recent study that came out in the collective intelligence literature. If you're familiar with Anita Woolley's work, she's been pioneering this work of collective intelligence, but she's been collaborating with computer scientists to examine how technologies influence collective intelligence. And this was a study published in CSCW last year. So she was looking at team productivity and the use of information dashboards, and how these dashboards, which we can think of as a form of externalized team cognition, how did that influence teamwork? How did that influence team productivity? The context for this was app development. So the simulation involved bringing teams of students together, interdisciplinary students, and they had different kinds of expertise, and they varied, they manipulated what kind of expertise was on those teams, and they manipulated how many teams on which the individuals had to work. So the number of teams you had to work with and that kind of expertise on that team. What they found was that the more teams you had to work with, that influence, that reduced team performance, and they linked that to memory load. That is, you're working on more teams, you need to know more people, you have to remember more roles that these people are playing on those different teams as you rotate around them. So just think about that in your own scientific teams, the kind of research team in which you're involved. If you're on multiple teams, you have to pay attention not only to the project itself, that is the task, but you have to pay attention to your teammates. What are their roles? What is their area of expertise? And you have to coordinate those roles and that expertise with the task at hand in such a way that you can efficiently meet these outcomes. So this information dashboard, what it did was essentially scaffold what we call a transactive memory system. That is, it improved their ability to make use of this kind of distributed expertise because it helped them. It offloaded their memory into the dashboard, and they knew who knew what. They knew who to go to help solve these kinds of app development problems. So a nice example of extended cognition, in this case team cognition, about different kinds of expertise and how that influences productivity. And then finally, with regard to embedded cognition, I pulled an example, a recent example by Bill Clancy. I'm sure that name's familiar to a number of you because he was one of the early adopters of situated learning and situated cognition. He wrote some seminal books on this topic. But if you're not familiar with what he's been doing, it's really intriguing, essentially taking this anthropological approach to study teams on Mars. So what he's been doing is embedding himself in what are called Mars analogs. And these Mars analogs are either up in the Arctic or in the desert Southwest. And what these teams in the Mars analogs have to do is act as if they're on Mars. So they live inside these habitats. When they go outside these habitats, they have to put spacesuits on. They go outside these habitats and they do science collection in the Arctic or in the desert Southwest. So they're basically role-playing, live role-playing what it's like to be an astronaut on Mars. And Clancy has been studying this for a number of years now, and he's been developing models for this kind of collaborative interaction and this really interesting kind of socio-technical system. And he wrote this up recently in a book on situatedness in place. And the reason I wanted to point this out is he's bringing in the philosophy of place into this thinking. So Clancy's really an eclectic thinker, and though many of you are familiar with situated learning and situated cognition, there's a whole area of philosophy on place and space with which you may not be familiar. So Clancy was trying to incorporate these ideas and relate it to situated cognition, and essentially what he was able to show through these kinds of ethnographic studies, looking at people in their interacting with each other and their technologies, that the activities that are afforded by this physical location have a very real effect on them, such that there's a felt and aesthetic purpose to what they're doing. So remember, these are people acting like astronauts on Mars, and they end up taking this role very seriously. So there's a felt embodied engagement to this place as they're planning for the mission to Mars. And because of that, it becomes a much more meaningful place for those people. So again, just an illustration of how teamwork is being studied from this embedded cognition perspective, but now taking situated cognition and expanding it through the philosophy of place. And as I said, there's a new, really interesting interdisciplinary book called Situatedness in Place that just came out that I think is going to have an exciting effect on how we think about situated cognition. So now to sum up this area, I want to encourage us to think across levels, because I specifically chose examples that were really within a small facet of embodied or embedded or enactive cognition. But we now need to think across these levels if we really want to expand our understanding of 4E cognition. And the organizational scientist Richard Hackman calls crossing levels of analysis this idea of bracketing. And from bracketing, what he means is when you look not simply at a single level, but a level above or a level below, it helps you better understand the potential causal mechanisms associated with behaviors within a level. So again, he was an organizational scientist who primarily studied teams. But because he's looking at teams in situ, he says, you know, these are individuals, which is a micro level, who are operating in teams, a meso level, but they're operating in an organization, a macro level. And he realized that he needed to understand the organizational context, these kind of top-down influences, and these bottom-up influence of being an individual if he really wanted to understand collaboration. So I introduced this as an idea because this notion of bracketing, by looking a level above or a level below the phenomenon of interest, it will help you better understand the degree to which 4E cognition is really influencing learning. So now we talk about the role of the body and interaction and others and artifacts in the environment, and we need to do a better job looking across these levels and the interrelations of these levels. And I just put together this kind of matrix to help conceptualize what this means. What does it mean to cross levels of analysis? So on the rows, we have embodied and active, extended, and embedded cognition. And the columns are essentially different kinds of measurements that you can think about: the physiology, the bodily responses, the communication acts, the use of artifacts. And I put checks in because those checks illustrate the particular studies that I just shared with you. And it's showing the kind of limitations that you can take. You can focus on a small area, but the point I'm trying to make now is you want to focus across these different cells in this matrix. So just a simple example. If we want to cross levels, we can look across measures and methods. So let's say you want to take an embodied cognition approach to learning. What would it mean to cross these cells in this matrix? So you can examine how changes in learning when you have this embodied cognition kind of intervention, but you want to correlate those changes not simply with the physiological response, but also with the body, the nodding and the leaning, for example, the gesturing, and the environment, the technology, the diagram use. So it's kind of using a suite of measurement approaches to simply understand how one learning intervention, an embodied cognition intervention, because you're focusing again within just one of these rows, how can that better illuminate what is going on with learning when you're looking at that kind of intervention? As another simple example, you can look at it from the standpoint of choosing a particular column and crossing the 4 E's as levels. So let's say you want to study communicative acts and the various kinds of communicative acts, but you can look at that now in situ. You can take the embedded cognition approach. You can look at it also with the use of artifacts and how the extended cognition comes into play. You can look at how bodies interact through the inactive and embodied approach, all how that relates to learning. So this is something that's likely more familiar to you, but I'm offering this as a way to frame the kind of research that has been going on in the learning sciences, but now frame it potentially within 4E cognition as a theoretical framework that may help us better understand what's going on in these different levels. So now to wrap up, I see I'm running out of time, so what I want to do is introduce some concepts from team theory that I think may help scaffold some of the research that's been going on in computer-supported collaborative learning. And what I mean by that is, as someone who studies teams, in looking at the literature that's going on in collaborative learning, I think there are some concepts in team research that may be useful to act as conceptual scaffolds or conceptual framing to make you more precise with regard to what exactly you are measuring. So at the more meta level, I introduced this as a kind of research issue of what needs to be understood. So we noted, we just went and talked about 4E cognition as this notion of how teams rely on each other, they rely on their environment, they rely on their technologies. The research issue here is we view teams as an extended cognitive system. So that's the broader meta-theoretical frame, is what is this extended cognitive system? And then, once you use that as a starting point, what kind of research can be done to pursue understanding, to pursue learning, when we think about this extended cognitive system? So what I'm doing now is I'm saying, what concepts from teams can be used in the context of 4E cognition to help learning researchers think more precisely about collaborative learning and how interventions inform collaborative learning when you have this broader perspective, this wider perspective of 4E cognition, or more generally, as a cognitive system. So I've got a set of research recommendations. These are just notional starting points meant to seed ideas for how you can use this kind of framework, how you can use these concepts to think potentially differently about the way you consider collaborative learning. So this has both theoretical and practical significance. So from a theoretical standpoint, again, I want to hammer home this point, 4E cognition is an evolving area. And by bringing in the CSCL community, I think it can really inform and help better develop the precision with which we think about 4E cognition. So the idea here is you're going to help create a better understanding of embodied and active extended embedded cognition. But obviously the practical significance should not be left out. By better understanding 4E cognition, you're going to come up with better interventions, you're going to come up with more precise measures, so it's really going to inform the practical ways to improve collaborative learning. So these are complementary ways to think about this framework of integrating 4E cognition, team theory with CSCL. So with that as kind of the foreground, now what are the recommendations I'm making? First and foremost, I want to introduce an idea from organizational psychology that distinguishes between task work and teamwork. And this is an important distinction, and I see it conflated quite a bit in the literatures that look at teams, that look at collaboration, that look at learning. So task work is the reason teams are brought together. Task work is what you need to accomplish, what are your objectives, what are your goals. And when we look at task work from an organizational sciences standpoint, because organizational scientists are interested in the KSAs, the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes associated with some phenomena, they break down the phenomena of interest according to KSAs. So when we think about task work, we can think about it from a cognitive standpoint. That is, what's the knowledge you need to understanding the relevant theories and concepts. So imagine you're trying to teach student teams about science. Well, you're trying to teach them science, that is the task of science, so you're introducing to them concepts, theories, and you're also introducing them behavioral components, which we would then classify as the kind of procedures, the routines, the methods that they need to use. But whether you're aware of it or not, you're also introducing particular attitudes about that task. So in the social sciences, you all live and breathe attitudes about empirical methods. So if you've ever been a social scientist working with the life or physical sciences, you know that there's different perspectives and different attitudes about particular methodological approaches. In your own field, I'm sure you have attitudinal differences about qualitative research versus quantitative or empirical research. And this is simply an example to illustrate that when you teach students these different kinds of scientific tasks, that is laboratory research or qualitative field research, you may or may not realize it, but you're also imbuing upon them particular attitudes about that kind of research. Again, my point here, though, is to recognize this distinction between the task on which they're being trained, that is the task they're learning, and now the teamwork. So the teamwork is actually the collaborative component that is needed for those people in the group to function effectively. This is what's needed to really execute the interdependencies that come with being in a team. Again, we can break apart teamwork from the KSA standpoint, that is the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes. So the knowledge here, we're talking about cognition. We're talking about the knowledge associated with your teammates. Do you understand, for example, their roles and their responsibilities? Of course, that's linked to the task work, but it's still a distinct part of the task work because teams members themselves can rotate across roles and responsibilities. And then there's the behavioral component of teamwork. This is simply an example of communication as one of the skills that's needed from a behavioral standpoint to work as an effective member of a team. So you can take communication as a particular example, and you can look more deeply at communication. And on a science team, what really matters is active listening. So if you're working on a science team, you really need to pay attention to your teammates if you want to solve this kind of complex problem, because you're brought together to work interdependently. To work interdependently, you have to know what the other people know. You need to carefully listen to them. So this is just an example of the behavioral component of teamwork that's necessary for this kind of task. And then last, there's the attitudinal components that come with teamwork. There's lots of research in teams on attitudes. You can think about something like trust. You can think about, in this case, collective efficacy. So as learning researchers, you're all familiar with the notion of efficacy, but in team research, we also talk about collective efficacy. That is, when you work on a team, to what degree does the interdependencies of you and your teammates produce this kind of collective efficacy? To what degree are you confident? Do you believe in that team? Do you believe you're really going to be able to accomplish this task? So this is a simple example of one of the attitudinal components. And at the more meta level, I think that differentiating between the task work and the teamwork will help you better focus on what is being learned. So from the CSCL standpoint, it's a focus on the L, what is being learned. Are you teaching them about the task? Are you teaching them about teamwork? And that then is going to drive the measurement. That's going to drive how you're looking at the interventions and help you illuminate how these interventions may be changing the behaviors, may be changing the cognition. And now I also wanted to think a little bit differently about the kind of support that's going on in computer-supported collaborative learning. So we can take this task work and teamwork dimension and we can say, well, are the teammates or are the technologies themselves supporting the task work? So are you using your teammate or are you using a particular technology to help you analyze data? Are you using the team or the technology to help you interpret information? That's a very specific or precise example about the task work and how you're using a teammate or technology to support the task work. But you can similarly think about teamwork and in such a way that you can ask, is the teammate or is a technology helping you act more effectively, more collaboratively with other members on your team? Is the team or the technology helping you provide a different way to understand roles, to know who does what work? So going back to Anita Woolley's development of the information dashboard, That's a kind of technology that was specifically designed to facilitate the teamwork. That is to understand roles and responsibilities on a team. And again, this is a way to get more precise with regard to what you're measuring, because that will help you better understand what is going on in your groups and your teams when they're engaged in this kind of collaborative learning activity. So the next recommendation similarly pursues this idea of support, but now uses this idea from cognitive science and extended cognition theory of offloading and scaffolding. So these are concepts that are familiar to you, but they likely have a slightly different meaning from the cognitive sciences. And this is something that David Kirsch, cognitive science at San Diego, has talked about. This is something Andy Clark, philosopher at Edinburgh, has talked about. Offloading and scaffolding are very important concepts because they help us understand how things are being used. And when we talk about offloading, we talk about things that primarily serve the purpose of a memory aid, and what they do is they free up cognitive resources. So a simple example is if you're in a meeting and you're sitting around a conference table and someone in that meeting jumps up and goes to the whiteboard and they start writing, jotting down ideas. That's a simplistic example of offloading. So what you're doing is you're saying, you don't have to remember this anymore. It's there in the environment. You've now externalized that memory. You've offloaded internalization into the world. So offloading frees up cognitive resources. So offloading can be used in such a way that by freeing up these resources, you improve the overall collaborative cognition. And you can juxtapose that with scaffolding. So scaffolding is related, but it has this distinction because scaffolding occurs when the actions of the artifacts themselves are supporting the cognitive and collaborative processes. So they are now starting to mediate the interaction. So these artifacts are mediating the interaction between the people, between the task in such a way that it's improving cognition and it's improving collaboration. And again, these are the kinds of things that you all have been studying in a number of different ways, but this is just the kind of conceptual scaffolding coming out of Fiore cognition that I wanted to introduce, because if you're publishing in these other domains and these other disciplines, make sure you're using the similar kind of lingo. So at a more meta-scientific level, as someone who studies interdisciplinary research as a phenomena, we see this problem all the time. That is, we see the introduction of new terms to describe old concepts. So, situated cognition, embedded cognition, these are the same kind of idea, but it's a slightly different terminology. And the point here is that when you talk about Fiore cognition, you're going to see these ideas of offloading and scaffolding pop up in the literature. And this is a way to, I think, frame and use these ideas to support the research you're doing in collaborative learning. But we can dig even deeper here and think about these prior dimensions of teamwork and task work, and then offloading and scaffolding, and start coming up with research questions. So again, my idea here is just to plant some seeds. This is a beginning point, not an end point. This is a way to think about how to link Fiore cognition with team concepts to better understand what's going on in collaborative learning interventions. So in the simple 2x2, you can think about the cell that is offloading and task work. So the question we're asking here is, are the teammates or are the technologies supporting task work through offloading? So, for example, are they helping store operating procedures or things like that being relied on for problem solving? So a demonstration of this is where you ask your teammate, hey, how do we do this? Or you go to an operating manual and say, hey, this is how we're supposed to do this. So that's a simple example of task work using offloading to achieve some goal. But you can also ask, are teammates or technologies supporting teamwork via offloading? So are they, for example, guiding information sharing? So a fundamental component of teamwork is this idea of information sharing. Teams are formed because team members have different forms of expertise. To make use of that expertise, you have to share your information, you have to share your knowledge. We know that teams that don't do this tend to fail. So technologies can be introduced, or teammates can be trained to better share information. So when you use your teammates to share information, for example, you may map who knows what on a team. So if you're working on a scientific problem, you may say, oh, there's the statistician on this team. That's the person I need to go to ask this question. Again, this is just a way to better frame and provide more precise questions to pursue the way these learning interventions may be changing teamwork. And now you can juxtapose this with scaffolding, and you can think about our teammates or technology supporting task work through scaffolding. So our technology is helping people interpret information. So team members explaining data, visualizations that are dynamically being updated. So I've seen this a lot in CSC research already from the beginning. You've been doing scaffolding of collaborative learning. So you've been developing kinds of technologies that scaffold cognitive processing. Argument representation is a nice example of scaffolding in teamwork. So those of you who have been doing that kind of work, you know that by externalizing the representation of arguments, it facilitates students' ability to critique and argue with each other. And that's just a different way of asking this question: how are teammates or how are technologies supporting this particular facet of collaboration using scaffolding? So this simple 2x2 is a way to think about these different kinds of questions that you can ask in support of 4E cognition and using team concepts to do so. So I want to introduce next as a recommendation that this community think about the C, that is the C for collaboration, and better define what do you mean by collaboration. And I'm introducing this because it's a topic with which we've wrestled in the team literature. And in the team literature, we often see collaboration, cooperation, and coordination used synonymously. And this has been a pet peeve of mine. So about a decade or so ago, I did this etymological analysis to say, okay, look, what do these terms really mean? So if you look back at the term collaborate, it has a similar origin from the 18th century about working together. So comb for together and labor to work with. And interestingly, cooperation has an older etymological origin, but it means the same thing. The origins of this word really simply mean to work together. But you can contrast that with coordination. So coordination is unique, and it has a much older origination, and it has to do with order, arrangement, and together. So it goes back to the 1600s, and it was derived independent of anything to do with people working together. So I bring this up because I wonder to what degree, when you study collaborative learning, are you simply looking at collaboration, or are you looking at coordination? And this is a fundamental distinction in the team literature. So in team research, when we talk about coordination, we pay particular attention to arrangement, ordering, and togetherness. And the definition by Michelle Marks and colleague that is used to describe coordination, kind of the canonical definition, is the orchestrating the sequencing and timing of interdependent actions. Remember, teams are formed because they have people on them that know unique things. You have to create interdependencies to make use of that unique kind of knowledge. You have to leverage those interdependencies in such a way that you can achieve more complex objectives than the individuals could achieve by themselves. And in order to do that, you have to pay careful attention to the synchrony. You have to pay careful attention to the arrangement, to the order, and how they are working together. So this is one of these differences that the team literature pays careful attention to, and there's a number of different ways of thinking about coordination. And the question then becomes, in CSCL, is C simply about working together, or is C about coordination? Are you thinking about how they are coordinating in groups? So this is one way to expand what you want to examine from the context of learning and what's going on in these groups. And then finally, I want to introduce this way to think about coordination and collaboration from the team measurement standpoint. Again, this is something that I see differentially being applied across various literatures. So when people look at groups, when people look at teams, they may be studying particular facets of the group work, but not necessarily paying attention to the collaborative components themselves. So in team research, there's been any number of measures of teamwork that have been developed. And team researchers are no different than any other academic. That is, they get their names by publishing different measures and different instruments, so you tend to see lots of different instruments out there for measuring teamwork. And some of you, you heard mentioned the PISA framework on collaborative problem solving. As part of that initiative, what we did was distill the dozens and dozens of measures of teamwork that were out there to identify a core set of collaborative competencies that could be used in the PISA framework to analyze collaborative problem solving. This is just one example of those measurement instruments that was created, the Comprehensive Assessment of Team Member Effectiveness. I use this one because it was specifically created for engineering teams, that is college undergraduates, because what was going on is in engineering curricula, they were throwing task learning at groups. They were using group learning to teach students about engineering concepts. But they realized, well, they may be learning the concepts, but are they learning how to work in a group? And in order to do that, you have to measure the collaborative processes. You have to measure the team processes. So the nice thing about CATME was it was theoretically grounded in the team literature, but they created a turnkey solution. That is, if you are doing group work in your class, all you have to do is go to the CATME website, sign up your class, have your students sign up their teams, tell them how often you want to assess collaboration, and you have this built-in self-assessment and peer assessment of teamwork. And this is an important distinction because not only is it giving you a theoretically grounded dimension of collaboration, but it's using the benefit of self-assessment and peer assessment. So you get to know not only what you think about yourself when it comes to teamwork, more importantly, you get to know what your teammates think about you. And what I've seen in the literature is what I call a Dunning-Kruger effect of team collaboration. That is, students tend to think they're much better at teamwork than they actually are. And we have some data to support that. And my point here is when you look at collaboration, then you should also be measuring the teamwork processes that go on with that collaboration, because that can help you more precisely inform what's going on in the learning and how these collaboration processes are interacting with your learning interventions. So this was just a set of research recommendations meant to plant the seeds. I've seen different aspects of this across your literature, but the goal here is now, if you're thinking about widening the lens of cognition, you can think about teamwork and task work to focus on what is being learned. You can focus on offloading and scaffolding as the kind of support, and you can link that with teamwork and task work to see how offloading and scaffolding is being used for those two distinctions. But also you can think about, are you looking at collaboration alone, or are you paying attention to the more complex construct of coordination? And last but not least, if you really want to understand collaboration, then surely introduce assessments of collaboration that have been informed and validated in the team literature. So I'll end it there. I hope that this was a useful introduction to 4E cognition and that it helped set the stage for thinking about the different ways that people have been doing embodied, enactive, extended, and embedded cognition. Thank you.
Thank you. You're still up here, though.
Yep.
Thanks, Steve, for giving such a wonderful overview and so much food for thought. So now we can take questions, so you get to talk some more.
Okay. There's microphones, a couple questions.
Hi, yeah, thank you for the very interesting talk. Yeah, I wonder what you could say a bit more about the boundaries of these extended cognitive systems, because basically what constitutes an extended cognitive system and what doesn't. And I think that might be relevant for CSCL.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a really interesting debate within the field itself, because some of the critics of extended cognition theory are really asking the same kind of questions, like, okay, where does cognition end? So a simple example is, well, we have Google. Is all the world's knowledge really then part of our extended cognitive system? And that then gets at an argument about, well, what about issues of access and the fluid use of that extended cognitive system? So one of the boundary conditions we think about when it comes to an extended cognitive system is ease of access, ease of use, the immediacy of the use of that technology. Is the technology transparent in the sense that you really don't have to think about it when using it? So this extended cognitive system, Chris used the word holistic earlier, so we tend to think about a more holistic extended cognitive system where you become one with that system in such a way that it's not separate from you but part of you. Yeah.
Thank you for your introduction too. Do I understand well that you don't make any difference between collaborative learning and collaborative work? That collaborative learning is just collaborative working and not such a thing as collective understanding or coming to a collective understanding?
Are you asking, do I see a difference between collaborative learning and collaborative work?
Yes. Or is it the same?
Well, this is where the task distinction.
Well, is learning just doing a task?
So the question then comes in, what is the reason the people are being brought together? So collaborative learning, they're being brought together specifically to acquire and apply specific concept. Collaborative work, you're brought together in an organization to achieve a particular objective, maybe making a new product, maybe coming up with a new finance plan, a new marketing plan. So this is where the defining what is the task that you're trying to achieve with this collaboration matters.
So learning is just a task, not coming to a development of understanding, to new understanding.
Yeah, I think you could argue that learning is a particular task for which groups are formed, and that's why I'm saying if that's the case, this is an empirically examinable question. So you can see whether there are differences in the collaborative processes when people are brought together to learn versus the collaborative processes when people are brought together to work. So, I made a claim, take what we use to study teams and organizations, collaborative work, see the degree to which it's related to and predictive of learning outcomes, and that would be a better way to answer this kind of question.
Thanks for your talk. I really appreciated it. One of the sort of elephants in the room, at least in our community, has been the degree to which embodied cognition is treated from a positivistic or quasi-positivistic framing versus a truly interpretivistic framing, and the ways in which ethnomethodology may be applied to think about things like gestural analysis and trying to better understand in a sort of culture-to-culture mode rather than a empirical positivistic psychological mode, what is going on in a space when people are moving around together. Can you talk a little bit about how that tension has or hasn't played out in the 4E literature so far?
I haven't really seen it played out that much because, remember, the origins were with philosophers and they were paying particular attention to contextual features. And from the way you just described it, it seems like they're conflating these ideas, and I think that they're probably orthogonal. I mean, you can take these different perspectives, and you can take an empirical lab-based view of embodied cognition, or you could take an ethnomethodological view of this, and you could use these different perspectives to better understand the phenomena. So this is the point about using specific concepts to unpack the dimension of interest, and when you more precisely say, hey, I want to look at this in situ, and I want to look at this embodied kind of approach, you can then think about reinterpreting what I described as the column framework, where you can say, I want to look at something like embodied learning, but I also want to look at it when people are using technologies, when people are in situ, and you can juxtapose that with a different kind of approach where you're crossing levels of analysis in the rows. So I think the precision with which you are framing the question will help you deconflate what you just described.
Thank you very much for your talk. It's fascinating, especially coming from also teamwork theory, teamwork community. And in CSCL, there is a growing interest in learning analytics, especially multimodal ways to get evidence, as examples you show. And I know that also in teamwork literature, even people in Florida just published a paper about using sensors for understanding collaboration. My question is related with the last bit of your presentation where you were talking about the assessment of teamwork and collaboration. What is your view in using these kind of sensors to automate the assessment of collaboration? Is it something feasible, risky? Yeah, what would be the view from teamwork?
Sure. So I didn't get too much into sensors. The exciting development in team research is using what are called sociometric badges. And these are kinds of, they're either Bluetooth, RFID, these kinds of things that team members wear. And what that does is track proximity and track how much people are interacting. Sometimes you also will get the communications, and you could look things like pitch and intonation if you're not actually studying the words themselves. So I think it's an important development because team research is very laborious if you want to get into the weeds associated with it. So what I'm seeing are two different dimensions. People who are just trying to make it easier to do team research, but also people who are trying to use more precise measurements of interaction to inform new theories and new concepts about teamwork. So the important issue is validity. And what we've seen over the last few years is tremendous variability in the validity of these instruments. And one of the issues is companies that make these often have proprietary software, and they're not informing the users what's going into the algorithms that say, for example, this movements indicate cohesion. And that's frustrated a lot of team researchers, so much so that some said, to the hell with the companies. They just went to their own engineering department and said, make me one of these badges, and I want to use it in my study. So they have access to everything. And the short answer to your question is it's an exciting area of research, but we really need to pay attention to the validity of things like sociometric badges, movements, proximity, and how they relate to these higher level constructs like cohesion, collaboration.
I think Art and then Yasmin also were trying to ask a question.
So I've got two challenges for this, Steve. One is that in terms of the physiological data on the driver versus the empathizers, that's kind of, I can see how that might work on grounding, where the whole group is grounded on a common problem. But in collaborative problem solving, people do such different things that I think the synchrony issue is limited. So that's one. The other is there's abundant evidence on reflection while people are doing, collaborative problem solving, periodically reflecting. And I don't see that as that embodied. So how would you deal with the synchrony problem and the reflection issue?
Sure. Yeah, those are interesting questions. And one of my specific areas of interest are task factors and how the task is really an important mediator of so much of what we study in teams. So you raise an important point about the physiological synchrony, and the point really has to do with the interdependencies associated with the particular task that people are using. So from an empirical standpoint, the answer to that question is let's manipulate the tasks, because that was one task and one study, and question the degree to which synchrony only matters in interdependent tasks, or what about tasks that you can juxtapose what they need to do, so-called conjunctive tasks where they don't necessarily have to be working at the same time on the same thing, and see the degree to which synchrony matters more or less. But the reality is we may see that it matters less, and that's informative because we can say from a bottom-up standpoint, what they're doing is changing the physiology and changing the collaboration. So I don't think it really limits the use of that measure. It provides an important boundary condition for understanding those kinds of measures. When it comes to reflection, that too is an interesting one, and reflection is kind of like the quintessential non-embodied view of cognition. And this is offline cognition is the way they refer to that. And remember I talked about Evan Thompson's and his view on mindfulness and the Eastern views of philosophy and how the mind and the body were not separated. Well, reflection is essentially a form of mindful activity. It's a form of mindful activity that individuals can do, metacognition. It's a kind of mindful activity that teams can do, team reflection as an example. So I'd submit that you may see a different kind of synchrony because there's been lots of studies of reflection at the neurological and the physiological level. So then the question then becomes, to what degree do we understand about physiological changes when individuals are reflective? How does that relate to when those individuals are now in a team and are reflective? So I think it would be a different kind of synchrony, but maybe synchrony nonetheless.
Thank you for your overview and great introduction into 4E. And I wonder whether you would consider introducing a 5th E, since now context already is part of collaboration. How about empowerment to address the issue of power, since you study teamwork in organizations, in schools? I mean, it's true of classrooms, all contexts, that power kind of interferes or interacts with collaboration or coordination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really an interesting dimension, and at a meta-scientific level, I'd need to ask, is that really different from the context, or is it merely a feature of the context? So if you want to argue that it's different, separable from the context, then maybe we need it as a new dimension. But if it's merely a feature of the context that you're studying, I think it then becomes a concept within situated cognition or embedded cognition that you want to study. But you're absolutely right. It's one of these moderating factors that you're going to need to attend to. And in the Teams literature, they talk about hierarchical structure all the time, just like you can talk about power dynamics in a classroom as well. So, I like that as an addition. I know it's really hot in here, and as a U.S. citizen who's used to air conditioning being put at 60 degrees, where we have terrible carbon footprints, I'm about to pass out up here. Yeah, but as I said, our air conditioners are kept on 50.
I don't have to wear a jacket.
Hey.
That's true. All right, thank you.
Well, let's have
Yeah, I had.